Hi, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Hello. Hope you've enjoyed your tea and buns. I think this is a great segue, actually, after the last session, which was on fiscal policy, because one of the big problems and concerns and risks going forward to fiscal policy is, of course, healthcare and demographics. So it's great that we have Anita Charlesworth today. She is the Director of Research at the REAL Centre, which is the Research for Economic Analysis for the Long Term. At the Health Foundation, she's an honorary professor at the College of Social Sciences at the Health Services Management Centre at the University of Birmingham. She's a health economist, so she can talk all about some of those issues, and has a background in government and public policy. Before joining the Health Foundation in May 2014, Anita was chief economist at the Nuffield Trust between 2010 and 2014. Please welcome Anita to the stage.
Thank you very much. And I was thinking after the last session that this is an afternoon of May You Live in Challenging Times. And I'm going to go through one of the other challenges of our time, which is the challenge of demography, and in particular their impact on health. I'm hoping, though, that my presentation won't be entirely depressing. Some things about my presentation hopefully will be quite cheerful in that some of the health challenges are in the nice problem to have, and some of the times we're living in with innovation and technology may mean that what looks at the moment to be really very difficult may become an opportunity. It always depends on the lens, doesn't it? So what I'm going to do is to set out some of the forward trends out to 2040 that we are projecting for health in England. That's based on work we've done with the University of Liverpool, taking an epidemiological model that looks at trends in risk factors such as smoking, obesity, diet, exercise, etc., and applying those to the levels of ill health that one might expect, understanding how those different illnesses affect people at different ages. Then what we've done is to look at what those trends in health might mean if we continue to meet those trends in the same way from a health system point of view as we do at the moment. And then the third area I'm going to look at is what those trends in health might mean for some of the wider economic and social outcomes which we're concerned with. I'll speak for just under 30 minutes, I hope, and so there'll be time for questions. So the first thing to say is we look at the population and divide it into three groups. People who are living without any illness at all. And in this, we look at 20 illnesses, which account for just over 2/3 of the burden of illness in society. And we're looking at the adult population. And my data here is based on the records that our GPs hold on all of our health. So if you've got ill health and your GP doesn't know about it and hasn't gotten round to coding it, then it's not in my data. But as long as you've been a good citizen and you are turning up for your health checks and your GP is a good citizen and is recording that, then you're in our data, and thank you very much. The second thing we do, though, is to think about people who've got some illness, yeah? So the first point at which in your medical record some diagnosed illness appears. But then we think about people who've got major illness. And the way we think about and define major illness is using a validated tool called the Cambridge Morbidity Score. And what that does is to think about what's the impact of different illnesses on the type of healthcare you need, on your mortality, and on your quality of life. And to give you an idea of this, if I had cancer, the Cambridge Morbidity Score would be 1.5. Only one condition has a higher score than cancer, and that is dementia. So what we do is we say 1.5 counts as major illness. So illness which is equivalent to cancer or dementia. But then we look at combinations of illnesses which aggregate to 1.5. Yeah. Now, most people who reach the definition of major illness in here will not have one thing, either dementia or cancer. Most people will be defined as major illness through a combination of conditions, and typically at least 3. Yeah. And so what we look at is how long, on average, do people live with no illness? At what age do they develop some illness? And at what age do they develop major illness, defined in that way? And how does that compare to life expectancy? And we'll look at that. Back in 2010, on average, people developed some illness just over 47. They then lived on average for 23.5 years with some illness before reaching the threshold of major illness at 70.7 years. They would then live for almost 10 years with major illness before dying. Yeah. And so what we see is between 2010 and 2019, the life expectancy increased by just over a year. More people were diagnosed with some illness at a younger age. That may reflect that GPs are coding better, capturing more of that some of us are going and disclosing a bit more. So we don't know to what extent that's underlying increased levels of illness or better coding, a bit of both, suspect. But the age at which people met that threshold of major illness fell ever so slightly to 70.4. So people through that decade were living on average just over a year longer with major illness. When we project forward then to 2040, based on trends in smoking, diet, exercise, obesity, etc., then what we get, again, is a further slight fall in the age at which people are diagnosed with any illness. The age at which people are diagnosed with major illness remains static, stubbornly static at 70.5, and we get a further increase in life expectancy. So what we're saying is over the next 20 years, and this is without the pandemic effect, over the next 20 years, got a further increase in the number of years that people are living in later life with major illness as things stand. So the holy grail, to some extent, of healthcare sustainability is compression of morbidity, that we live a long life, we live most of that life in ill health, we have a very short period of ill health before we die. And at the moment, we are struggling with compression of morbidity. That's on average. Within that are some quite important trends then in the conditions that people are expecting to suffer with. And some of this I'll come back to because I think in particular quite interesting for both the health system but also for wider changes. What you see is 3 conditions which are the big numbers and 2 of which are on current trends projected to increase further very substantially. So diabetes may not be surprising to people given trends in obesity. Yeah, anxiety and depression for everyone who is conscious of employee, beware, and children, deep concerns about levels of common mental health problems. They are very, very large in number and projected to grow. And as I want to say, this is before the pandemic. I haven't got pandemic effects in here yet. The third one, though, that we don't talk about very much at all, really, is chronic pain, which is the biggest individual condition and projected to increase from 5 million people living with chronic pain to over 7 million on current trends. As I said, most people have combinations of these things. Chronic pain and anxiety and depression are very commonly go together, not very surprisingly. So when you look at that, that's the individuals on average. Of course, the other thing is that, as I showed, that pattern of ill health is has a very important age component to it. So then what we do is look at the number of people who might be expected to be living with major illness based on those projections when you apply those to the population projections from the ONS. And what you get here is, and I've stratified this then between people of broadly working age up to 70 and people above working age, is that in 2010 we had 5.3 million people living with major illness, 2.5 million of which were of working age, almost 3 million were over the retirement age. By 2019, that had increased by 1.3 million, and that might explain why over the last decade the NHS didn't suffer from austerity in terms of its budget being cut, but actually it did, performance deteriorated substantially before the pandemic. We were seeing a lot of pressures. Government would say we're spending more money than ever and we've got more staff than ever on the NHS. That was true, but it is the Red Queen we run to stand still, because what happened through that period is instead of having 5.3 million people with major illness, we had 6.6. And also, as we're all aware of, with the concerns about economic inactivity due to ill health, during that period, 600,000 more people of working age were living with major illness. So going forward, we see with the baby boomer generation moving into old age, further significant increases in the number of people living with major illness. Over the next 20 years, 2.6 million more people. Big increase, obviously, in the over 70s living with major illness. But up to 2030, we're projecting a further growth, even without the pandemic, in the number of working age people living with major illness. And we're worried about this, I guess, because, I mean, those are big numbers in their own right. But the working age population contributing to government revenues, providing the workforce for a health system that might need to meet all this ill health, increasing by 11%, number of people living with major illness increasing by 39%, creating potentially huge challenges across the board. So that's the picture in terms of major illness. What does that mean then for the funding pressures that the health service might be facing? And for this, we look at both the health system that we've got at the moment, changes to the population, how that health of the population is changing. But we also need to think about the cost of providing care. And we need to think about the range of treatments and the standards of care that we expect. So in particular, obviously, innovation changes what the health service can do, but also societal expectations about what should be provided change over time. So we had a look at two scenarios around that. One that we call minimal change, which looks at the pre-pandemic trends in the way we provide healthcare, that change in morbidity and population, some shift towards more mental health, community and primary care, because that's what health policy has talked about for decades. We also look at what might need to happen to NHS staff pay as one of the biggest inputs into the health service, reflecting that over the last decade, NHS earnings in real terms had fallen. Some continuing growth in productivity with a modest recovery from the pandemic, and some increase in capital spending. And then we look at a second scenario, which we call sustained improvement, which says that actually coming out of the pandemic, we need to meet the rising pressures of this additional ill health, but actually all of the public satisfaction data, all of the data from Ipsos, who survey on what are the issues of concern, says what the public satisfaction data says that the public have never been less satisfied than they are now with the NHS. And the Ipsos Mori data shows that the concerns about the NHS are consistently in the top 3 set of issues that the public are concerned about. So a scenario that says that the job of government is to keep the NHS at the same standard as it is today doesn't seem like a very tenable and sustainable political strategy. And we have a lot of industrial action. And I think today the pharmacists, the latest group, have said they'll go on strike, and underlying issues around that. And to the point that was made earlier on, an undercapitalised system as well, with the need to grow productivity. So we look at a slightly more ambitious package of reform alongside meeting that underlying demand. And what this gets you to in terms of our analysis is annual real terms increases in health spending of somewhere between just under 3% under my sort of minimal change, steady the ship, and almost a percentage point a year higher if you want to make material improvements. That compares to a very long-run historic average. My figures are for England because health has devolved, but long-run data series on health spending are only available for UK. So if you do the very long run back for the UK, it's about 3.6% a year annual average increases in health spending that we've seen. If you want to calibrate those against other projections that are around, the OECD, looking more narrowly, I think, at the demographics, taking less account of the health and the dissatisfaction with standards as they are at the moment, get a level of 2.1%. The IFS analysed the NHS's plan to grow the workforce from the past government and backed out what that might imply in terms of spending on healthcare. And their analysis suggests that long-term workforce plan is consistent with funding growing by 3.6% a year, and the OBR's fiscal risks, which is not the very latest ones for September, that were the one before, had about 3%. So we are in all of these scenarios above GDP per head, and in most cases substantially above GDP per head. So it's quite hard at the moment to produce a sort of reasonably credible projection for health spending, which is anywhere close to GDP per head. And we are not alone in that, but that's what I take. The other thing it's interesting to think about then is how health spending has played out over decades in the past. And it's not an advert for government planning of public services. Incredible volatility. And I think you can see that we have had 3 decades in which health spending has been closer to GDP per head, the 50s, the 80s, and the 2010s. In each case, they have been followed by a decade of higher spending. Yeah, and so in these cases, the 2000s obviously stand out at a very high degree. It's interesting to note that actually the 2010s were below the 1980s as well. So the sense in which we would be bucking very substantially all history if we were able to keep health spending down growth down very substantially through this decade. And in those periods, demography was being kind to us. And now demography is being much less kind to us in terms of health spending. So what the government has done, obviously, is announced spending envelope for 2025-26 and set the spending review totals out to 2029. For a shorter period of time, I can do the England growth rates, and that's 3.8%. The announcement in the October budget is very close to that and very close to the figure that we were suggesting in our analysis. So in one sense, that's great. What's quite interesting is it's, as the IFS have said, it's quite hard to see how beyond next year the overall spending review numbers add up if health is going to sustain that amount. Picking up one of the themes from earlier, the amount you spend obviously does matter, but there are also, I think, three other things which are really clear. The first in this work is that actually, if we are to be able to have a health system which is fiscally sustainable and meets public expectations, productivity is going to have to be absolutely central to health policy, and there'll be many things that need to be addressed to improve productivity. But one of the issues is the health service is almost certainly undercapitalised, and it has, for example, a backlog of maintenance of £14 billion now, which is just eroding value. So a capital-rich settlement was important, and they've delivered that. Thank you. The second issue, actually, which I hope the earlier slides show, is the big issues which Wes Streeting has talked about the balance of spending on prevention versus meeting immediate need. And the budget said warm things about that, but as yet, there's no real plan for how you actually move money to prevention and how you deal with the potential challenge of double running, because most of the things that we can do to prevent don't deliver an immediate benefit. There are lags. So ensuring within this that we are able to ring fence and prioritise prevention. And the third thing, which I'm going to come and talk about when we look at the wider implications of some of these patterns, are really quite difficult societal issues about balance of spend on older people versus younger working adults, balance of spend between areas that are more deprived versus general improvements across the system. Because it'd be very difficult to do everything. And so, let's skip over the next two, which are not. So, in terms of thinking about the implications beyond the NHS, one of the things that I mentioned before is that obviously we are the numbers of people of working age with major illness is rising, and although there are more people with major illness who are older, and that increase in people living with major illness of working age is not randomly or evenly distributed across society, and it is concentrated in people living in more deprived areas, and actually inequalities in illness start very young and then grow, but then by the very elderly there's actually much less inequality, probably because lots more of poorer people have died by then. So we're projecting forward significant increases in major illness amongst working age people in deprived areas. And so this is showing the number of people living with major illness by age in 2019, which is the red bar, and so this is the working age. Working age obviously is, as I said, up to 70, and then older people. That's the number of people, and so on your left is the 10% most deprived areas, and then we've got the 10% least deprived areas. And as you can see, in the least deprived areas, most of the rise in people living with major illness is amongst people who are over retirement age. But when you look in the most deprived areas, there's a significant growth in people of working age living with major illness on current trends. In fact, when we add that up, 80% of the increase in the working age population with major illness is in the lower half of the distribution in terms of deprivation. There is actually a relatively little inequality amongst the projected increase in major illness amongst older people. So the concern here is that these trends will increase health inequalities, but also with the concern about health being a barrier to employment. You get geographical concentrations in major illness, more people in those areas of working age, not in work. The other thing which I think is an important, and that one of the things obviously the government sets ambition to do is to increase the employment rate up to 80%. And the health as a barrier to that, and health as a driver of inequality seems to be a really important thing. The other implication, I think, is for pensions, obviously. Because if you go back to my first slide, at the moment on current trends, on average, we are developing major illness at 70. And so if we are to, so compression of morbidity, that shorter time period, much closer to the age of death in which we're living with serious illness, compression of morbidity is obviously beneficial to us as individuals, beneficial for the health service, but also quite important in terms of sustainable pension policy as well. And the OBR in their latest fiscal risks, was having a look at the wider economic gains to health. And I guess in terms then of trying to help people to be able to work and to both at younger ages in deprived areas and also in terms of the pensions age. Again, what's interesting is the conditions that dominate here. So anxiety and depression, chronic pain, and type 2 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes is front and centre of the NHS's thinking. We've done quite a lot of work on anxiety and depression, and the NHS is trying to move towards parity of esteem between mental and physical illnesses, has had a policy to try to invest in mental illness, and there is been trying to work through improved access to things like psychological therapies. But coming out of the pandemic, there are still really big backlogs there, and big questions like, should we be prioritising, therefore, people who are at risk of losing their job for mental health services, or in the health service, we have always prioritised based on presenting clinical need. So if we have problems with access and constrained services, what do we do? Chronic pain has very, very little focus, again, in the NHS. So the NHS is starting on this idea of a 10-year plan. And there are obvious questions which I've raised here about how much we spend, how efficiently we spend, but I think there are some really important questions to be addressed about what we spend it on and what we prioritise. If we cannot do everything, how important is the contribution that health makes to our economic prosperity as individuals and society, and to wider inequality in the way we make choices about how to allocate resources. And those are quite deep and profound questions that we need to address. So I will leave it there so that we can have questions and comments. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anita. Well, so my conclusion about that is that I probably should do more exercise and eat better. I mean, I think it was a fascinating presentation and also disturbing all in one. I guess one point that you brought out very clearly from that was the point about debt and the risk of the public finances. The OBR has already published a report over the summer which showed just how high debt ratios could go over the next 50 years. Does the conclusions that you come to, does that risk it going even higher than those numbers? They were talking about almost somewhere between 250 and 300% in 50 years' time.
I think these figures are very consistent with the OBR's estimate. I guess they shine a light on why the OBR consistently does have such a high figure in for healthcare. Yeah, because there are, and in particular, I think the fact that we've been talking about being the ageing of the population for quite some time, it will obviously be a knowable change. But the reality of what that meant, I think, perhaps as a society we haven't addressed as well. And although we knew that we were going to have a lot more older people, I think what is an increased demographic risk now is the reduction in younger people and some of the health trends that we're starting to see, whether that we've got a rapidly declining birth rate, but also post-pandemic, which isn't factored into here. The health of that younger generation, in particular their mental health, is a concern. And if you look at the data on the rise in economic inactivity due to ill health, one of the things that I think is deeply troubling is the number of young people who are going from education to inactivity without passing through work, and the potential scarring effects from that on our long-term prosperity is something that I think is worrying.
And it's not only the demographics, is it? It's not the fact that it's just people aging. You were talking about also the proportion of people who were of working age who were experiencing more illness as well.
Yes, and I think in particular, I get the inequality profile in that is really worrying, and that's important, I think, for the economic agenda, but also for the government being able to tackle some of those geographical inequalities. Stephanie was talking earlier about the end of the levelling up agenda, but the underlying issue that we have areas of the country that are really not thriving remains, and this health picture is part of that. And I guess, we've got some other things which I haven't talked about here, and all of Angus Deaton's work on the US, on the deaths of despair and falling life expectancy amongst some of the most disadvantaged groups. Women in the lower socioeconomic deciles in the UK under 50, their life expectancy is now going backwards. So we're not of the orders of magnitude of the US situation there. But I think whereas even 5 years ago, you might have looked at the Deaton work on death despair in the US and thought that's awful for them and thought that it wasn't going to happen here. I mean, you get more worried now about what is happening to the health of younger people in more deprived areas.
And those bar charts that you showed, I mean, that was the most striking one for me, which apart from the 80 plus, every one of them showed just how income and wealth was really important in determining those health outcomes.
Yeah.
We've got about 6 minutes or so for some questions, and I can see some hands up already. Let me take, I can't see who you are because of the lights, but one right at the back in the middle.
Hi. How would your scenarios change if there was widespread adoption of GLP-1 drugs at, say, 10x lower price than current?
Yeah. I don't fully know yet, because I think we don't know the extent to which it's just the physical weight, if you like, which the obesity drugs deal with, or whether in a way the physical weight clearly does have an impact, but whether or not the physical weight is one of the manifestations or of the wider impact of people's lives on their health, and whether some of what we're seeing at the moment mediated through weight would reappear in other health problems, if you see what I mean. But I think if you can clearly reducing obesity would be very advantageous. It's a major risk factor for a number of those conditions. It would also contribute to some of the chronic pain conditions as well. I mean, the price is is obviously a rather important factor in that. I mean, and this is why it's really difficult as well to the other area, which I think may be quite important over this next decade, and enormous areas of uncertainty, is whether or not we're going to get major innovations in dementia as well. And if we did, at the moment, dementia is oddly sort of quite cheap for the NHS, because we can't do very much. So some of these things as well will move, for government, one of their challenges is will move spending pressures around the system as well.
That hand was the first one up at the very back.
You mentioned the move from sickness to prevention. Are there any sort of lessons from other countries that have done things better that we could learn? Like Japan, for example?
Yeah. So on prevention, I think in particular the need for policy-making frameworks, budgeting cycles, which are longer term. So I've argued that if we're actually going to shift to prevention, we need to start to have to think about prevention in the same way that we ought to think about capital, and ring fence it and set long-term ambitions for that. One of the challenges, I guess, that we really need to think through, and is all governments struggle with, is that the costs of prevention often fall in one budget area, but the benefits are extremely diffuse. And so we can write business cases that show that prevention is excellent, but actually aligning the incentives for budget holders with those business cases is enormously challenging, because the people who bear the cost, we haven't worked out how they capture those benefits. So I think, and I haven't seen a health system that really figured out how to do that. So what all health systems, however they're run, tend to do is to dictate, if you like, and protect, because incentivizing it really well is quite difficult.
We've got two final questions, one here and Abhinay over here as well, please. So can we start with you, please?
Hi, Anita. Thank you for the really interesting presentation. I'm really interested in the relationship between health and housing, and I was wondering how you think the 1.5 million homes that Labour want to build might have an impact on the healthy years of life.
Yeah. So housing is obviously one of the really important social determinants of health, and it's both obviously access to secure and affordable housing, but also the quality of housing. And this again is one of those areas where you can see with prevention. I mean, the idea that we are spending so much money now on asthma care and respiratory care for and sending children back into homes that are riddled with mould, it doesn't make sense from an economic, let alone a sort of moral standpoint. But again, the spending on housing is obviously local government. Again, those benefits are diffuse and don't tend to fall then to either the housing association or local government. So it's a really good example of that problem of how do you incentivise the housing sector to take some of those health benefits seriously.
And finally, Abhinay.
Great talk. I was fascinated by the fact that you're looking forward the next 15 years, and this government probably has a mandate for the next 10 years at least, I think. And therefore, the question was, how do we deal with those numbers at the end, the last 5, 6 years, 35, where you make an investment now? You didn't talk about technology. The role of technology wasn't mentioned in your slides. Obviously, prevention was brought up in the questions. So the question is, have you got any numbers or any scenarios that you have calculated that shows how those numbers might be different if we invested more in prevention, taking into account technology and stuff like that? We're just interested to know, you had a figure, a chart, which says, look, if we did so and so, numbers won't be what you showed us earlier on.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So the estimates of health spending are hugely dependent on what you expect to happen to productivity, and technology is potentially an enormous driver of productivity gain, and we can see lots of areas where new technologies could make an enormous difference to the productivity of our health system. But at the moment, we don't have a lot of the basic foundational enablers, like, so you need consistent electronic patient record everywhere, core levels of digitisation across the health service. So we still don't have a lot of those foundational benefits. I've seen some estimates from the US that are saying around what AI, for example, could do. And I think David Cutler's done an estimate that's about kind of 10%. And I think I'm really interested in sort of doing work in that area. But at the moment, the budget did ring-fence building essentially on what Jeremy Hunt had done before, some of the capital investment into the foundational building blocks. But it's not just money. I mean, one of the things the NHS has got to do is to make sure that it has an effective digital strategy, and it doesn't at the moment. And the other thing as well is that data is one of our biggest assets now in the NHS, not just a tradable asset, potentially, but also asset in terms of our own understanding of the potential for productivity and how to do that. And we're not set up to realise the benefits of that data when it comes as well. So I think if this agenda doesn't feature very prominently in the 10-year plan and subsequent work, we're very unlikely to be able to manage even with the sort of figures that I've put up.
Thanks very much, Anita. A fascinating presentation, if not a bit grim, but I think there's lots of takeaways for the government for that one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, well, this is the graveyard slot, pièce de résistance, which however you like to look at it. I think we have two remote speakers who are going to magically appear on the stage. Then Rebecca, if you want to join me. Okay. Very effective stage management here. So we mentioned at the start, I think George kindly mentioned, that we have been doing a bit of investing in geoeconomics at Bloomberg. So we have around 50 economists doing a lot of the same things that people in this room do, but we'd increasingly found that there was so much at the overlap of economics and politics and economics and geopolitics that our clients were interested in. We felt like we would import geopolitical expertise, but put some numbers on it where we could. So Gerard De Pipo, who came from many years in the US intelligence community and then also as a senior fellow from CSIS, was one of the people who helped us set up that group with a particular focus on China and Taiwan scenarios. He's got on the far side of him Henrietta Trays, who's a managing partner and director of economic policy at Veda Partners. I was trying to find out where you are. Are you in the US as well right now, Henrietta?
I am, yes.
Yes, right. So we have Washington over here, or Washington, New York, and Rebecca Harding is an independent trade economist and founder of the brilliantly named Rebeccanomics. So thank you to all three of you. We're going to sort of spend, and I suspect there'll be loads of questions as well. So I will try and keep it relatively brief. I'm just looking at how much time we have. But clearly there's an enormous global impact from the re-election of Donald Trump. And even though many of us in this room, if you'd asked us any time in the last year, who do you think is most likely to win, we quite likely would have said Donald Trump. There's thinking that, and then there's being here and getting the alerts. I've been keeping my eye this afternoon to see if we find out our Treasury Secretary, but getting the alerts. In fact, it's too early for that because most of his announcements have come about 9 p.m. US time, and sometimes in the even earlier hours than that. But as these things come through, and each one has potentially a seismic effect, certainly on parts of policy making in the US, but also predicted and unpredictable consequences for the rest of the world. So we're going to get into all of that. Maybe, Rebecca, Henrietta, I will start with you just because we're sort of thinking through some of the appointments. And I would also want to get Gerard's view on this. But just sort of 1 week in, I mean, it's obviously been a much faster pace of transition from Donald Trump. What should the rest of the world think about the appointment so far, and I guess the broader position that Donald Trump finds himself in with control of both houses of Congress as well?
Yes, I mean, the widespread control of Congress is probably the biggest factor. The president-elect has already gone way above and beyond what we would expect, most recently with the naming of Matt Gaetz as his potential attorney general. If you're familiar with the background behind this, Matt Gaetz has been investigated by the Ethics Committee. He is a massive Trump supporter and has been a huge advocate of President-elect Trump. And he is expected to be charged with some pretty serious crimes by the House Ethics Committee tomorrow. And this appointment...
He was. He's now retired. He's now resigned from Congress, though, right? So he won't actually...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's just the reason I underscore this is that the president feels like he has a lot of latitude. And it goes even so far as to now have circulating the idea that he will disband the House and Senate for a period of 10 days so that he can have recess appointments, which is something that our Constitution allows for, but has never been done. So I really relay those points to say, there are no bars on this. The president's trade agenda, the president's tax agenda, all those components are very real, should be taken very seriously. And the nominees that the president has announced on the China front, for example, with Marco Rubio, are illustrative that he was very serious on the campaign trail. I think one thing to really focus on is this inclination towards czars. My focus is mostly on tax and trade, so I'd highlight the potential for Bob Lighthizer, the former U.S. trade representative, to be something of a trade czar, which would put him in a seat of authority over not just the USTR, which he ran and imposed the Section 301 tariffs through, but also the Department of Commerce, which has seen a lot of expanded authority around 232 tariffs for national security threats, as well as exhaustive export control restrictions and further sanctions. So everything that he's doing there suggests that what he said on the campaign trail, he's quite serious about, and is putting the dominoes in place to effectuate those legislative ideals.
And Gerard, I guess your follow-up to that, but also thinking specifically about the sort of stance with respect to the rest of the world that we're seeing in these appointments.
So in the U.S. system, the executive has a lot of discretion when it comes to foreign policy and increasingly with trade, although the Congress might matter with that. So The president can pick pretty much anyone. A lot of them have to be Senate confirmed, but as Henrietta said, that he's probably going to have a compliant Senate, so he'll be able to pick probably whoever he wants, although Gates might be a question. On the campaign trail, Trump said a lot of things that weren't necessarily consistent. And one of them is that he was also running as the peace candidate, which is essentially an isolationist bent that treats the threat of World War III as the number one risk, particularly over Russia and Ukraine. There was hope on the right, and some parts of the right, that this sort of more isolationist wing would win out. The appointees thus far, with the exception of Tulsi Gabbard, are pretty strongly hawkish and more traditional conservative. And so there's been some disappointment on that part, sort of the Tucker Carlson part of the right. What does it say about policy? Well, if you take their views literally, it does suggest a more hawkish bent, but I would caution everyone to not overread what the appointments mean in terms of policy. I think Trump is primarily appointing people based on personal loyalty, how well he thinks they will represent him, and how well they will do on camera, et cetera. I would also expect a lot of volatility in the administration, as happened in the first administration. However, if you just take their views at face value, it's a pretty confrontational set of people, especially Rubio, somewhat Waltz, rest of the world. If I'm China, I'm not happy with the way things are going. It certainly is close to the worst case scenario. We're waiting on Bob Lighthizer, but he's probably going to join the administration, possibly as trade czar, as Henrietta said. So we're set for at least trade confrontation with China. In other areas, the national security side, the U.S. is quite powerful. There's, a lot of the bureaucracy and resources go towards that. Trump himself cares primarily about trade. He's less worried about national security in a way that it's discussed in D.C. So, for example, he has said repeatedly that he wants to slow or maybe even stop the forced divestment of TikTok by ByteDance. He's also said he's open to Chinese investments in the U.S., including for electric vehicles. He might personally believe that, but the rest of the system might not. So that will be a point of tension. But for him, as with the first administration, trade will be first and foremost. Otherwise, when you get beyond China, I would say in Russia, Ukraine, our view is that it will push towards reduced aid for Ukraine, but it won't be an immediate cutoff, in part because while Trump says he has a plan to end the war in 24 hours, that's not credible. Both sides have quite divergent interests and war aims at the moment. And also, I think that Trump would not want to deal with the chaos of that. And there are also a lot of others in the administration who wouldn't support that as well. But the baseline for Ukraine doesn't look good. It's definitely downward trending. In the Middle East, that's trickier because Trump so far has picked people that are very pro-Israel, even much more so than even Biden was. I'm hearing different things about what it means for Palestine, but generally it's probably going to help the Israeli position. With Iran, they're going to go back to the maximum pressure campaign of sanctions, but I would not worry too much about the U.S., say, attacking Iran, because Trump actually has pretty isolationist or restrictionist views about the direct use of military force.
And just before I come to you, Rebecca, I mean, Henrietta, one of the things that was said before, and as I said at the beginning, there's kind of imagining a world after the election and then there's actually being there. But before this election, one of the areas we would have said where there was going to be relative consistency between either a Harris or a Trump 2 administration was this sort of basically America first, certainly more aggressively protectionist, but certainly sort of strategic trade policy, particularly with regard to China. Do you think that's still, would we still say that? Or actually, to Gerard's point, because he's driven by a slightly different set of considerations, actually even the economic side of the international policy could feel quite different?
Yeah, and we're already sort of seeing the impact that the president is hoping to have. Just today, we're going to see a bill that is going to get introduced on the House side that will strip China of its permanent normal trade relations status, aka strip free trade with China from the laws. That's different than the administration acting on its own via USTR or the Department of Commerce. This is Congress potentially voting in a way that they haven't in about 80 years to raise tariff rates across the board, from durable goods to non-durable goods, the energy sector, the mining sector, et cetera, via legislation, which is a permanent change. It would allow for Congress to sort of start accepting revenue and use that revenue to offset the 2025 tax bill. It's very expansive. My expectation is the first thing that Bob Lighthizer does is call China out as a violator of the phase 1 trade agreement. That is something that I've heard him say directly. I very much expect that that will happen. He'll probably give the business community a couple of months to pull forward any orders. I'm not sure whether right now, whenever he is nominated, will start that clock, or if it will start on January 20th when the next president is inaugurated. But I'm looking at tariffs coming in April or June at the latest, based off of the enforcement mechanism in the phase 1 trade deal. But this is all going to happen very quickly. And I think the tariffs, importantly, will go on before there's any certainty about the tax bill, which probably won't be done until December of next year. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's
well, it has to be said, even if Bob Lighthizer has a very firm view of where trade policy should go, but but crucially, he's someone who understands the system extremely well. I mean, if you read his, I'll bring you in, Rebecca. I mean, if you read his book, this is someone who spent a lot of time either very at close hand looking at the WTO, and is not entirely wrong in his criticisms of the WTO, but certainly he knows his way around. He's not just a sort of knee-jerk protectionist.
No, he isn't. And I think what's important about the WTO is just how he has worked within the framework of the WTO to undermine it.
Which the Biden administration didn't always.
Which the Biden administration didn't. Now, I think there's a way of looking at all of this in terms of a glass half full and a glass half empty. So from an economic perspective, there are two things that could happen. We could see everything happen, as Henrietta says, really quickly. Now, that's a glass half empty approach, because it means that Trump is coming in, he's using his political mandate that he's got now. And let's be honest about it, none of us sitting in this room would have predicted the size of the mandate that he has. And what he's going to do probably is use that mandate very quickly to change things. So the glass half empty says, right, immediately we're going to see 10 to 60% tariffs imposed. There's not going to be any negotiation. Trump's approach is, I export more, you export less, I win, you lose. He connects immediately with his voters to say, there you are, I've done something to make America great again. So politically, he's doing something that connects. Now, the problem that we have is that has an immediate economic effect. It immediately puts up prices and it immediately adds to the general geopolitical and geoeconomic uncertainties that are out there in the world. So what that then does is it says to China, right, you've got the right to slap on sanctions now, you've got the right to do tariffs. The European Union is already thinking about those types of things as well. And obviously, of course, the UK is just bobbing around in the middle of the Atlantic somewhere or the other, wondering what the hell to do with itself. But the glass half full approach is, okay, it might take a little bit longer, that his advisors are a little bit more strategic about it and use his more aggressive approach towards tariffs to negotiate. And that is not beyond the bounds of possibility, because President Trump has done that before. And if he does that, then the effects might take longer and it might not be quite as cataclysmic in terms of breakdown of institutions.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because our chief US economist actually was on secondment to the White House, to the Council of Economic Advisors in the last Trump administration. And she says precisely that. She says if you actually look at how they introduced the tariffs, there was quite a lot of care about which ones were the easiest. They actually tried to have the minimal effect on inflation and disruption from things that were easy to swap out of, high import substitutability. And it was only later in the process where they were moving up the sort of production, up the supply lines. And I think I think there's a real debate about whether it will look like that, or whether it will be sharper, as Henrietta says.
And I think one of the reasons for keeping the powder dry on Lighthizer is because he might actually be more measured. He likes to do all of this within the legal frameworks. So he doesn't want to be seen to be breaking the law as such. He wants to be able to bend the law maybe, but he knows all of those institutional frameworks so well that he's actually able to use them for the purposes of America. I mean, there was a piece, forgive me for mentioning the Financial Times in this hallowed place, but there was a piece that he wrote in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago that argued very forcefully that it was the rest of the world's fault, that it wasn't America's fault that it had this huge trade deficit, and that we needed to recalibrate everything on American terms. But again, I want to go back to that point. This is about actually not doing any damage, if you like, to the contract that Trump now has with the electorate. He's got to make sure that he doesn't push prices up too quickly, because that's one of the things that he's actually promised. And while we might all say, but it didn't seem to be the economy stupid this time round, it actually was the economy stupid, but not 2.8 versus 3.4. It was, we can't afford our groceries. So that's where he's not going to want to budge. He's going to want to make sure that he holds to that promise as well. He'll do it somehow.
Gerard, this is quite a fundamental point. I mean, not just on the sort of details of what happens with tariffs, but the sort of general approach. A lot of people have said, a lot of people around Trump have said, don't take it too seriously, 100% tariffs, 60% tariffs. In the majority of cases, this is going to be about leverage and, part of a transaction. He's so transactionalist. But others say, well, apart from anything, he wants to make money. He wants to use it to raise revenues. So there will be more across-the-board tariffs. And he really does want to push China out of the market in the kind of aggressive way that Henrietta was talking about. What do you think, Gerard?
It matters within the administration who ultimately gets Trump's ear or gets it last. So it's possible that Lighthizer wants to move quickly. There's also reports that he is trying to work with Congress to embed the universal tariff in legislation, so it would be harder for subsequent presidents to overturn. However, if he does that, it also means Trump can't use it to negotiate because it's embedded and that's the end of it, right? And so, as you mentioned, Anna Wong, our chief U.S. economist, there is a sort of optimal way of doing it that is more measured, that is probably more in line with what the likely Treasury Secretary will want to do or what the CEA or NEC wants to do. But then there's also the more aggressive approach that might be much faster. We don't know. I think one thing to keep in mind, though, is that the Trump administration at this time is much more prepared and that they have a lot of executive orders and other things ready to go. So whatever the normal timeline, it's going to be expedited. But ultimately, it's going to be Trump's decision. And even if you talk to someone like Robert Lighthizer and they might have a confident view of what they want to do, it doesn't mean that that's what Trump's going to end up doing. So I think the questions are timing, what mechanisms, so IEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or maybe Section 301 could be in play. There's a limit to what USTR and what Commerce can do in terms of actually processing that many investigations per year. But a lot of this is uncertain. I think no one actually knows, is my view.
Henrietta, we'll sort of, I think we'll also be sort of segueing a bit into the impact on the rest of the world. But a lot of this is just about absorbing what's at play and how different sides of the emerging administration would look at things. How important is the Treasury Secretary role? I mean, I remember thinking when I worked at the US Treasury, it was surprising relative to the UK how powerless the US Treasury is relative to, at least in terms of like classic things like control of the budget. But in this environment where actually President Trump has so much control over Congress as well, how should we think about that Treasury Secretary position, and how much could it sort of offset some of the other quote-unquote wilder hires?
Well, I think Treasury is incredibly important, maybe first and foremost because we're going to have to hike the debt ceiling early next year. The suspension period expires on January 1st, and usually we get anywhere between 3 and 8 months of functionality. So there will be a role for the incoming Treasury Secretary to be informing Congress about when that bill is going to be needed. But with all due respect to you having worked in Treasury, I used to work in the U.S. Senate, and I always think that they're the most important, which is a bias that I just cannot shake. So when it comes to the budget, the appropriations process, you're absolutely right. The buck does not stop at Treasury. Indeed, Treasury has no authority over what money Congress appropriates. So it's going to be a situation where there is maybe, to speak directly to the incoming potential Secretary, Scott Bessent, whom I'm sure many of you have heard from, that the expectation is that he will be the next Treasury Secretary. One of the things he talks about is that there will be, in order to offset the cost of this massive tax bill, which will be almost $5 trillion, there will be not just tariffs and revenue generated from those tariffs, but also massive spending cuts on the magnitude of $2 trillion, if you believe Elon Musk. That money is appropriated by Congress, and you need 60 votes to get any changes of any magnitude, let alone $2 trillion, to actually be effectuated. And I can tell you for sure, those votes do not exist in the US House or Senate budget committees or the appropriations committees or in the chamber as a whole. So I agree. The Treasury is important, certainly in messaging around things like the debt ceiling and the urgency there, which we'll have to deal with in 2025. But when it comes to federal spending, they have no authority. That's all in the House and Senate.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, the $2 trillion is like a third of government spending. So yeah, it's definitely not going to happen. I think we probably should sort of step out a bit in terms of how the rest of the world. I mean, Rebecca, you talked about the UK bobbing along in the ocean. Our own editor-in-chief has actually written a piece saying that the re-election of Donald Trump spells an existential threat to life as normal in Brussels. What do you think?
I think there are lots of things that pose an existential threat to life as normal in Brussels.
And yet
at the
it always
moment.
continues.
And yes, it always continues. Now, I think there's something very interesting going to happen now, because I mean, if you listen to defence and security professionals, if you listen to economists within the European Union, there is actually quite a big division at the moment going on between the European Union and the United States, and it's been there for quite a long time, and it's around budget allocations, and it's around budget allocations particularly to defence, and that's been there for a long time. Now, the problem is that the European Union itself has its own problems at the moment. I mean, it's got Hungary, it's got disagreements around all sorts of things going on, so the European Union is rife with difficulties itself at the moment. But the election of President Trump within Europe, or the impact on Europe, is actually to make Europe think about its own security. It has to go on, it has to go beyond this sort of idea of strategic autonomy. It has to think about its relationship with China. It has to think about what it's going to do in terms of its own defence spending, how it's going to allocate resources there, how it's going to use organisations like the EIB, for example, and then how it's going to allocate to its own economic and security and defence spending in NATO. So those are big existential problems for Europe. Now, if you then look at the UK, I mean, there's already been talk in the press, which I think is a little wild, about, oh yes, it's going to be dead easy to get a new trade agreement. And well, I mean, Boris Johnson came out and said it anyway. So he came out and said that last week, that he thought there was going to be a trade agreement. I think the UK is somewhere down the bottom of the pile. That we actually have a budget deficit in goods with the United States.
So crucially, Trump thinks there's is the only country that actually has a surplus.
Well, it's
so
a
we
surplus.
might get off.
It's a surplus in services. So that's important. But I think what's really interesting here is the fact that we are going to, if we do get a deal, and if there is any relationship that we have in terms of trade, then it's going to have strings attached to it. So it will have significant public procurement considerations. It will have implications for agriculture. So it will have strings attached. Now, I think actually, ironically, what it might do is actually push us back closer to Europe again. And it might push us back closer to Europe again through NATO. Because there's an Article 2, a collective defence in the NATO treaty. There's a lot of thinking around how to allocate budgets because of America for the last 10, 15 years talking about budget allocations. This isn't a new thing. But President Trump will be much more aggressive. He's threatened to pull out of all of those things as well. So I think actually looking at it from an economic point of view, we may come back in through supply chain resilience, which is actually trade, back into the NATO fold and actually be able to talk more objectively with our European partners. And it's certainly UK government policy to be talking more with Europe than it is to be talking with the United States at the moment.
Gerard, you said at the start about the sort of ideological makeup of some of the international officials. If you're the UK, I guess one way to look at it is Trump is really not someone who enjoys multilateral engagement. So you might want to emphasise how you're all alone and it's just the UK and you can have negotiations. But with respect to Europe generally, Is it the Senate that's going to provide the sort of guardrails for sticking with NATO and preserving that sort of basic, maintaining some sort of support for Ukraine? Or is it just the prospect of bad press? What would it be?
Partially the Senate, but also former senators like Marco Rubio, who might be in the administration, right? So there was a potential lineup of the Trump cabinet a week ago that looked quite different and could have been much more, say, Eurosceptic or NATO skeptic. That is not really who he's been appointing. And so Trump, we've already been through this, right? We already had a Trump administration. He had threatened before NATO, and he did not pull out. I think as long as NATO partners are spending more, or at least convincing him they're spending more and buying more U.S. weapons or making their own weapons, there's enough durability there in the U.S. institutional structure and really in the national defense industry to keep things going.
Henrietta, do you agree with Gerard on the basic sort of bulwark for defence, but also specifically in the Europe case?
I think there's a couple components here. First of all, the defense sector in the United States, the Army generals, the military generals, they are very staunch supporters of NATO. So I think there's going to be sort of that behind the scenes, if you want to call it the deep state, support for NATO. I think that will very much be continuing. If you've spoken with any military generals of any rank, they would say that is amongst their highest priorities, if not the top. So I think that that's going to be something that measures President Trump next year. And I think Marco Rubio falls into that category as well, as Gerard says very succinctly. On the defense spending side, I think we're also going to see a continued upward spend. There is this view that there's going to be massive federal spending reductions. And one of the core reasons why that is not going to be the case is because they want to continue increasing defense spending. And as we mentioned before, you need 60 votes in the Senate to get any spending through. So as domestic discretionary spending rises, defense spending will also rise, at least commensurately, if not more. This is also an area where the Democratic Party, if they choose this agenda, has the considerable latitude to continue providing aid to both Ukraine and Israel. You will not be able to get a bill through the House and Senate that doesn't get you 10, 20, maybe even 30 Democratic votes in the Senate. So that is a great way to offset whatever Trump says he wants to do on Ukraine with the legislative realities of actually appropriating these funds, which is something that's going to also serve as a bulwark against some of the things that he's said on the campaign trail.
I was quite struck, Rebecca, that I think it was actually The Economist was saying this week that quite a lot, and we'd heard this on the ground, quite a lot of senior Ukrainian officials were actually kind of hoping for a Trump victory because it was sort of a throw of the dice and they were just finding it, they're gradually sort of losing ground, literally, in the war. And the sort of drip approach that they felt the Biden administration, despite the rhetoric, had taken, was ultimately going to lose them the future, and that the prospect of a sooner negotiation by Donald Trump was potentially, a wild card they'd accept.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of where should I start? There's a lot of really interesting points around that because, Ukraine is at the moment, its supply chains are cut off. So it's sort of iron and steel supply chains are cut off by the action that Russia has taken to circumvent what Ukraine did in Kursk. Its troops are exhausted, but on both sides, neither side will stop until they both feel that there's... I used the word once in front of a bunch of Baltic state countries. I said off-ramp, and they got very upset with me. But until there is some kind of end, some kind of negotiation, nobody's going to be happy. And the thing is, Russia will not accept the fact that it won't have access to Crimean ports, etc., that it has control of grain. Ukraine will not be able to accept that Russia has that control. So what President Trump is going to have to do and his negotiators is going to have to do is provide that exit strategy, let's call it that, rather than an off-ramp. Now, I think because the US has a power projection that it wants to start start exhibiting now. It might be more able to do that than President Biden was. And I think that's actually quite an interesting proposition because it's able to start afresh. It hasn't got any baggage, but it does want to be able to say we are a military power that Russia and China and the Middle East has to be scared of. So that while national security may not be an issue as such, President Trump definitely wants to project that military power as well alongside everything else. So I think that might give him some leverage over President Putin, that maybe one of the problems of the Biden administration was that he wanted to do this through trade measures, through sanctions and export controls, etc., in order not to trigger the nuclear response that President Putin had actually triggered on the 28th of February 2022, which is sanctions and export controls are as much an existential threat as any military engagement might be. So I think it's kind of the summary of that really is that President Trump is coming in. We know that he's going to take a more aggressive approach. We know that he's going to try and solve the problems very, very quickly. Whether or not he can do it is moot, but he's going to take a much more binary approach. And I think we're in a very different security situation now than we were back in 2016.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's clear. I think we'll get on to questions in 1 second. But Gerard, just to follow up on that, I mean, there's several people who said to me, look, you won't like it, you won't like any of it in terms of the sort of, the principles at stake and what's been given. But in a year's time, you're more likely to have had an end to the hot conflict in the Middle East and an end to the hot conflict in Ukraine with a President Trump than a President Harris. Do you agree with that? That there will, however much distasteful they might be, there will be deals done.
I think it's possible. I mean, part of this is the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, is very process oriented and can be self-deterred. That is kind of the opposite of how the Trump administration will operate. And if you're dealing with authoritarian governments, they might be more responsive to blunt threats, which, despite whatever Trump might have said on the campaign trail, I think he might be prepared to at least make. Whether they believe them or not is a different question, but they also won't be certain they aren't true, right? So there's the ability to maybe bludgeon and get, like the Iranians, for example, or clearly didn't want Trump to win. Putin maybe slightly did, but less so than in 2016. So I think there's plausibility with that, but of course there's downside as well.
All right, I suspect there'll be lots of different parts of the world or different aspects of this that people will want to ask questions about. So I'm going to open it up. Lady here.
Hi, well, thank you very much for that. It's been fascinating. One thing we haven't spoke about is deportations. Trump estimated deporting 5% of the US labour force. That's obviously a huge number, would have implications for GDP, wages, inflation. Do you think that's realistic? Will he run into logistical issues? Obviously, there are huge moral issues about that, but also the cost of such a policy would be massive. What kind of numbers are you guys thinking about? Thank you.
Henrietta?
Yes, thank you. It's a really good question, one that the business community asks all the time. Obviously, they're very concerned about it. These are, we're at 4.1% unemployment. That's full employment. We, very much have needed these immigration jobs. A little bit of this is culled from anecdotal conversations and statements that ICE and other agencies responsible for patrolling the border have made in the last couple of years. As you know, since January, the immigration rate at the southern border has dropped off precipitously and is now back down to 2022 levels. As a result, ICE has testified to the fact that they are pretty maxed out. They are using every man they have. They are, deploying drones. They are using the court system to the extent that they are capable. Obviously, President Trump is hoping for more than that. So I think there's two things. One, I'm not sure that there's a lot more that we can do on, finding illegal immigrants. They say they're going to start with, some of the worst offenders, but that sometimes is expanded to say all illegal immigrants, find those individuals and then deport them. I think from a manpower perspective is going to be pretty difficult. And then you asked the perfect question about funding. you are not, again, you're going to have to go through the budget committee in the House and Senate and the appropriations committee. You're not going to get that funding. The best opportunity for that was in this earlier this year, when there was a bipartisan bill that would have spent more on ICE, would have spent more on boots on the ground, more drones, more capabilities, more judges, more facilities, et cetera. The Republican Party decided not to support that piece of legislation. And so now a path to getting more appropriations for those agencies is going to be even more difficult. At the margins, there are things that the president can do to sort of shuffle money around within the appropriations that he's already got. But as soon as we get into mid-December, when they have to pass another government funding bill, we're going to have this fight. And whatever money is appropriated there is going to dictate what ICE and those agencies are able to do on immigration in 2025. Right now, the goal is sort of torn between passing a government funding bill through March of 2025 and one that passes it through the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th, 2025. So that conversation is going to take place in the next couple weeks, right after Thanksgiving. They'll have our first foray into seeing what kind of funding levels or plus-ups they'll get for Customs and Border Patrol, and Democrats are going to put up a fight. They do not have a 60-vote majority in the Senate, and as a result, Democrats, the minority party, is going to exert its will very substantially and effectively. What I always say is there's nothing the majority can do that will overcome what the minority will not do. So spending money on these issues is going to be something that runs through the Democratic Party, and they're going to have their stamp all over it.
Because the Senate is so good at saying no to things. Right, there is a... yes, there was one we already had there, and then...
Just in terms of universal tariffs against Europe and other countries around the world, excluding China, what's the timing of that, do you think?
It's my view... Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Who wants to... I think we might get... I don't know who wants to... We've discussed it a bit, but...
I would say we don't know. And this was the glass half full, glass half empty, really. There is everything in place to do it quickly, as Henrietta said, but whether or not Trump will do it quickly and use it as a process of negotiation, I think we have to wait and see. I think everybody has to hope for the best and prepare for the worst, that it might be more of a negotiating tactic, actually, over a period of time. But I think the stance towards China in particular is going to be very severe relatively quickly. It might be less severe towards Europe immediately. And there's always a spillover effect from that, because it will make things difficult.
Well, the European Union has definitely got the wait and see strategy nailed. I think they're very good at that. Okay, there's here, actually in the oh God, I can't remember. Middle here. Yeah, and then we'll go to the back. Maybe we'll take a couple this time.
Thank you.
Middle.
Filippo Gatto from MAP. And one question, obviously, Trump won a big mandate. He's got a lot of latitude, but he's not omnipotent. So there are probably some guardrails. It could be kind of the stock market, the bond market, inflation. It could be Congress. Which one is the biggest limiting factors that he might find that could actually contain?
Let's take the back as well.
Yeah,
we've
quick.
Touched on that.
Just thoughts on Pillar 2, because the rest of the world is going ahead and implementing it, not just Europe, it's being implemented in Latin America as well. How does that fit into the mix in terms of coming to the table and negotiating? And
Who wants to take that? I think we've had some stuff on Pillar 2 even today, I think, but no. No one wants to go for it.
What is Pillar 2?
You're talking about Basel, are you? Oh, on the MAT? Okay, the tax.
I mean, if the under-tax profit rule isn't defined in the right way, there will be egregious extraterritorial measures to impose taxation upon U.S. multinationals, which the Senate will be very unhappy about, I suspect.
Yeah, there's a lot of opposition to Pillar 2, and I think in general, just a dim view of foreign countries taxing, the way that many lawmakers see it is just as a land grab on revenue from U.S. multinationals. That said, at the same time, the tax bill that they're going to write next year, the path of least resistance, and there is a lot of resistance from a lot of different components, but taxing and raising the GILTI tax rate, for example, or the BEAT tax rates, those multinational components, are very much at risk, and I would say much easier than for instance, raising the SALT cap or keeping it at 10K, or repealing the clean energy tax credits that are in the code. It's always easier to tax somebody that's multinational rather than a domestic corporation or individual. So I think there's a lot of risk there, but unwinding or reinserting themselves into the Pillar 2 talks and Basel talks in general is something I would absolutely expect. And I wanted to answer the first question, but I'm embarrassed to say I forgot already what it was.
It was actually, well, I'm going to ask, I might ask Gerard that, because it was about the sort of what's going to be the greatest guardrails or constraint on Donald Trump. We've spoken a lot about the Senate potentially being quite a big constraint because of the rules of the Senate allowing the minority to be quite strong. But the mention was of the bond market and the stock market. I mean, thinking back to the previous administration, how much of a check on Donald Trump was the market's judgment, Gerard?
It was less, though, than people would have thought going into it. So before the trade war against China, the Chinese government, many believed that investors, the market, and also just Trump's contacts would discourage him from actually pulling the trigger, but it didn't stop him. However, the conditions were different. Maybe this time, if there actually is, for example, should he try 60% tariffs on China, there will be a massive impact on the stock market. He might respond to that. On the other hand, as he said in it multiple times, including in his interview with John Micklethwait, he doesn't really believe that tariffs are bad for the economy. So someone saying this will cause inflation is probably not going to get anywhere. I think the market's responding might. I would say, in addition to Congress, there's the courts. I would not bet that they matter all that much given the direction of things, at least at the margins. I think the other part is the bureaucracy. You can call it the deep state if you like, but managing the federal bureaucracy is very difficult. There are things that Trump tried to do in the first administration that he was unable to do despite giving orders because he didn't know how to follow through on it. So, for example, he ordered DOD to pull out of Afghanistan. It was a direct order. It was disobeyed. Same thing with Syria, it was disobeyed. I was in the government at the time, they didn't care. It's because there's a way of just saying, okay, thank you, sir, and then delay. And I suspect if, for example, someone like Matt Gaetz is at DOJ, you're going to see a lot of that happening.
Rebecca?
I think there is another risk here, which is this is not an administration which is going to need to get re-elected in the sense that it doesn't have the electoral constraints on it that it had. It's got a massive mandate now, and so it doesn't have the electoral constraints on it because it will be a new Republican ticket that comes along at the next election, so it hasn't got those constraints. President Trump loves the market. He loves the market going up high. And I think, stock markets actually for him are one of the indicators of his success. But I think one of the interesting things might be to watch, which will be the value of the US dollar, because he doesn't like the dollar being too strong, actually. And so he would actually quite like to see the dollar come down. And so maybe paradoxically, from the position that it's in at the moment, he might be measuring his success by the power of the US dollar in the future.
Yeah, I think he's like all these politicians. He sort of doesn't like, he knows that a strong dollar is not good, but he doesn't like the idea of people sort of not betting on the US. So I think it goes both ways. I would recommend, without sort of just not a sort of ridiculous plug, but the hour interview that, if anyone hasn't seen it, that Donald Trump did on a stage in Chicago with our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, apart from anything else, was a really interesting window into his view of tariffs, for example. It goes all the way down, and it is completely internally consistent. It's not incoherent rambling. I mean, he did ramble a lot, but he has quite a clear view of tariffs, and it's worth taking a look. Okay, there's a final question, because there were quite a few. Right in the far corner there. Oh, sorry. I think there was one. Was there one first? I've lost track. Okay, the far corner. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Really interesting set of comments. Neville Hill from Hybrid Economics. You've spoken a lot about the risks to, I guess, free trade in goods from this administration, against the backdrop of a lot of the discussions we've had today about the size of government debt and government deficits and the need for governments, and particularly the US government, to potentially finance a huge fiscal deficit in the future. Do you think there's any risk that this administration starts to interrupt and throw spanners in the works in the sort of free movement of capital globally and capture more of those capital flows for its own benefit? Or failing that, is that the point at which the independence of the Federal Reserve comes under greater pressure? Thank you.
Who wants to take that first? Maybe
I'll go first with that and sort of sideways answer it, if you see what I mean, because I think that there's something else that's going to happen with the Trump administration that we're not even particularly thinking about at the moment, which is revenues in because of regulatory arbitrage. By putting someone like Elon Musk in charge of a big, huge deregulation agenda and thinking already about the incentives in service sector to move financial services, etc., to move to America. And the other thing that we're seeing in financial services, which we haven't discussed at all, which is the separation out of global payment systems into the SIP system and the SWIFT system. And we've seen a big shift in all of that over the last couple of weeks, announcements from the Bank of China and so on. I think actually what we're going to see is more of an arbitrage and more of a pressure for companies that are going to be working with the US to avoid secondary sanctions. They're going to have to absolutely tie themselves into the US dollar and probably locate in the US as well. And I think that actually is a way that that money will be generated. I think you are beginning to see the signs of not just a trade war, but actually a financial war breaking out between actually China, Russia, North Korea and Iran, and because of the alternative payment systems that are there, and they're using the renminbi, and I think that's the one to watch actually.
And he is pretty conscious of the role of the dollar in the international
very much so.
system, and it's under his watch. It's going to be the global capital of crypto as well. We should remember.
So, but no central bank digital currency.
I don't know who goes. Henrietta, sort of a final word and maybe a response also on the capital flows and the position of the US.
Yeah, I think the trade and the sort of America First agenda very neatly dovetails into this whole investment component in general. And you see it in a number of different places. One nation we haven't talked about yet is Mexico. And this is an area that the United States has a huge problem with Chinese investment going into Mexico, flouting the trade agenda, the Section 301 tariffs, and other export control restrictions. And it's worth mentioning that in 2026, there will be a review of the USMCA. Bob Lighthizer, obviously, also the architect of that renegotiated NAFTA provision. And my expectation is that investment into Mexico, investment into Canada by China, other ways to avoid transshipping or to effectuate transshipping to avoid the tariffs. Those are all issues that are going to be front and center. And maybe one parting thought here is that Congress is going to pass one bill. They're going to pass a tax bill next year that probably incorporates the debt ceiling with it. And then that's it. They're going to be off in a 2026 midterm election cycle. It's going to be very much like what we saw in 2017, where the president has to focus on Congress for the first year, and the back half, the last 3 years of his administration, are going to be exclusively orchestrated via executive action. So whether that's regulatory changes, the trade landscape, tariffs, that's what those remaining years are going to be concentrated on. My expectation is the House will flip again back to Democratic control. It's possible that Democrats pick up the Senate, although that's a long shot. But the first year is going to be tax bill, debt ceiling, et cetera, with Congress. And then the last 3 years are going to be all about that deregulatory component, a big, huge focus on the USMCA, which the president will have to agree to. And then, of course, trade and tariffs throughout the whole 4-year term.
That's a very good roadmap, Henrietta. And Gerard, I guess your sort of final thoughts and response maybe on the capital controls thing, but just generally maybe in the same spirit, sort of things that we should be watching for in the next year or so, what the rhythm of this will be like.
So on capital controls, in Lighthizer's book, he briefly talks about the idea of managing the current account by targeting the financial account. This is something that Michael Pettis and some like Oren Cass at the American Compass talk about. I don't see it getting much traction, and I think a lot of the Wall Street inclined administration members are going to resist that. So I don't think that's going to be how they do it. I think Trump is going to rely on tariffs, even if you think that targeting the capital account would work better. in terms of just like general guidance, I would say over the next 4 years, focus on personalities, maybe even more so than policy, as hard as that may be to do. We talked about the U.S. Treasury and whatever it can and cannot do. Steve Mnuchin in the first term had influence well beyond what a normal Secretary of the Treasury would have. There will be something like that, or maybe several versions of that during this administration. And so ultimately, it's about being in the room with Trump and convincing him. And a lot of times, things you think were being discussed as part of an interagency process are not really being moved up to the Oval. And only when it gets into the Oval does it matter. Then what was discussed in the interagency process doesn't matter. This is actually how the trade war went down against China. And so focus on the people, focus on Trump, and that's the at least season 1 of the next 4 years.
Okay, well, that's plenty to look forward to in the next series. Gerard, Henrietta, and Rebecca, thank you very much. All right. Well, one thing for this audience, I should say, there's the one reason why you might want to could be reassured about the prospect of higher inflation under the a second Trump term, is that my colleagues have been telling me, and some of you may know, the BLS, the key statistical agency in the US, is very, very underfunded. It's had more or less frozen in real terms its budget in the last few years. It's been begging, it's having a lot of troubles with its surveys, like here, it's been begging for more money, and it doesn't look like there's any prospect of it getting more money in the next few years. So if the less money we have going into the BLS, we may not have an inflation problem at all in America, in the same way that Argentina managed to control its inflation problem for a long time by just not having the statistics. But thank you very much for all of you. I think George probably wants to say a few final words, but we were delighted to have you at Bloomberg, and I hope you enjoy your drinks later after George's farewell.
I'll be very, very brief, but we've had some fantastic speakers today. We've had from Bank of England to IMF, from academia to industry, a real diverse array. And I think the theme of revitalising the global economy couldn't have been more timely or relevant. We heard from Catherine Mann, of course, who thought the right approach to monetary policy setting under uncertainty is one of activism, although she thought that was actually appropriate to keep rates on hold. That was what her conclusion was. We heard from Ray Newton-Smith, who talked about all the good bits and the bad bits of the budget, and much about industrial strategy. Vita Gasper, who joined us from Washington, talked of the rise in government debt ratios, the prospects for public debt going forward being even worse than what they look like with political pressure for governments to spend more, meaning upside risk to debt ratios. Anita Charlesworth looked at the various statistics on illnesses which are likely to rise as the population ages, but also even higher among the working age population, with significant repercussions for higher spending. And then that last session, I don't know how to summarise that really, but I wrote a few things down from what people said. Henrietta talked about policies on tax, trade in China being very real. I love Gerard's point about he's hired a very confrontational set of people. And I think that was really quite illustrated by Rebecca's point, who suggested that, relatively speaking, Lighthizer is measured. So some great comments from everyone, and really enjoyed the whole conference. So thank you very much to our distinguished speakers, our dedicated organisers, and all of you for participating today. I think the contributions that you've made have been really interesting, some great questions. And I look forward to seeing how those discussions come to fruition over the course of the year, and also to catch up with you at all the SPE events that we've got upcoming. Please do stay engaged with the SPE over the coming year. Just a final thanks to Bloomberg and also the behind the teams and in front of the scenes tech team. And also particularly Stephanie for hosting today's event, and also for the generous provision of lunch and drinks which are now being served. So thanks everyone for coming, safe travels, and enjoy the hospitality. Thank you.